there, welcome back to my YouTube channel. This week's video is going to be a little bit shorter than usual because I'm only going to be showing you one technique. I'm not going to be showing you the start to finish process of the project that I'm currently working on, which is this little cupboard here that my mum found actually. It's not real wood, it's not even got glass in the door, it's just perspex. So I'm going to do something funky with it, and part of that technique is a raised stencil. So that's all this video is going to be, just concentrating on how to do a raised stencil, because every time I do a raised stencil on a piece of furniture, people always ask me how I did it. So I thought if I just concentrated this video on that one technique, there's always going to be a point of reference on my YouTube channel that I can send people. So having said that, let's do a raised stencil. So the first thing you're going to need is a stencil. This technique only works with a standard style stencil, which is this, as in you've got the mylar stencil with a negative space. It won't work on something like a silk screen stencil because the product that I'm going to use to put over the stencil won't go through the silk screen stencil. So it does have to be just your normal kind of stencil. The other thing that I am going to use is a bit of painter's tape. I'm going to put some tape around here so that my Dixie Mud doesn't go and spill out over the edges. The other couple of things you are going to need is some kind of medium to make the stencil raised. I use Dixie Mud. It comes in 3 colours, brown, white and black, and then also a spatula of some kind. This is a Dixie Mud spatula that comes from Dixie Belle. It's plastic and I like that because it's a little bit flexible. It's not too kind of scrapey. Sometimes the metal ones can be a bit too harsh. And then finally, the other thing I'm going to use is some spray adhesive. I don't know if I'll be able to link this exact one in the description below because I can't even remember where I got this from. But if I can't find this one, I will find a very similar one and link it below. This is a low tack spray adhesive that is specifically designed for mounting things like stencils and cards and crafting and that kind of thing, which means that it's only a temporary sticky thing. It means you can reposition your stuff. You can wash it off the back of your stencil, absolutely fine, but what it's going to do is help my stencil stay flat on this surface. If I'm doing a very flat surface and there is no kind of detail around it, like a drawer front for example that's very flat and very plain, I usually won't bother with this. The only reason I'm using this today is because I've only got a very small area and it is recessed, it's got a frame around it. So I want to make sure that the stencil stays flat to the surface, because if it moves, you're going to smudge all your Dixie Mud and you won't get those nice crisp lines on your raised stencil. What I am going to do is lie this flat because I feel like you're fighting with gravity when you're upright. If you've got no choice to be upright, if you're working on a very large piece and you have to have it upright for whatever reason, then you can't really get around it. That is when spray adhesive is your best friend, or a little bit of painter's tape. But if possible, I do find lying something flat, so if you're taking a drawer out, lie it flat so you're working face down, face up, face down. The piece is face up, you're working down, if you know what I mean. So you're not fighting with gravity. If I am trying to wrestle with this stencil and kind of put it here and hold it on and put the Dixie Mud on and do all the things, it's fighting to flop off. And this stencil is quite a large size. If you've got a smaller stencil, obviously it's not going to be quite so much of a handful, but because of the size of this and the fact that I'm working on a small area, I'm going to lie it flat on its back, and that way I'm not kind of fighting with this floppiness. Okay, so I have taped out the frame. That just means that my Dixie Mud isn't going to spill over onto the outside of the door. I'm just going to concentrate the design on the centre here. And then the next thing you need to do is figure out where you want your design to sit on that panel or whatever you're putting your stencil on. Obviously on this one there's a kind of large central damasky thing in the middle, and then, you know, kind of smaller ones around the edge. I'm not really one for symmetry, so I don't think I'm going to put that dead centre. I don't know where I'm going to put it. I'm just going to figure out the placement and then we're going to apply the mud. Okay, I quite like it there. That's just kind of, the bigger piece is kind of just sitting on the corner, so it's not like a big central design, which is what I didn't want to do. So I quite like it there. And then what you're going to do is get your spray adhesive and spray the reverse of the stencil. Always read the instructions. This one says, place your item over the top of some scrap paper or card. Spray the adhesive lightly from a 15cm distance onto the reverse of the item you are positioning. Wait 30 seconds for the glue to become tacky, and then firmly press the item into place with your hand. So that's what we're gonna do. Just got to wait for that to go tacky, like the instructions said, 30 seconds. I could sing you a little song in that 30 seconds. I'm not going to. I'm just going to cut to 30 seconds time. Okay, that feels about 30 seconds-ish. So I am going to just place this on where I wanted it to go, which was kind of about here-ish. I've got to contend with this little handle, which won't come off. So I'm just going to push that down over the top of the stencil so it's poking through, because you want your stencil as flat as possible on there, hence the reason for the spray adhesive. So just going to make sure that that is positioned and then press it down. This is quite a delicate stencil, so you're going to make sure that every single little bit is pressed down, if it will. So as I mentioned, this is a repositional spray adhesive, so it's not super strong. So you can see areas here where the stencil is wanting to be forced back up because of the lip that runs around the edge. So that's fine, it's got the majority of it. If you wanted to, you could put tape around it as well and use masking tape to secure it down, but I think I can work with that. Next you need your Dixie Mud. Like I say, this comes in 3 colours. I'm just using brown because it'll be easier to show you what I'm doing as opposed to using white over white. So you're going to want this, and then you are going to want your spatula as well, and can I bring you a little bit closer? And then I usually work in one direction rather than trying to clear in the centre and kind of work it out. I usually just work left to right, top from bottom, or whatever, but whatever is comfortable, whatever you're comfortable with. You want a little bit on your spatula, not too much. The key thing to do is actually not use too much Dixie Mud. The biggest problem that people have is when they use too much mud and it kind of gets a bit messy. If you just use a little bit, it'll still show up as a raised stencil, trust me. And then you just want to smooth it over the stencil, trying to hold it down as much as you possibly can. I have not made this easy for myself because, like I say, I'm doing this within a framework, which is obviously the panel is recessed, so it's making it a little bit harder for me. Also, I have had many fails at raised stenciling. The good thing about it is it's really easily wiped off and you can just try it again if it does work out wrong. And that, I believe, is where the phrase famous last words comes from. Okay, I've just stopped already because I know that these corners are they haven't gone to plan. That's okay. I'll show you what I mean. So this is looking absolutely fine. Obviously here, there was a combination of too much Dixie Mud and the fact that the stencil wasn't lying flat on the surface because of the frame around the door. So we're going to go back to the drawing board and I'm going to wipe it off and I'm going to try again. I'm just using some disposable shop cloth and a little spritz of water to remove the wet Dixie Mud. So I'm back with a different stencil. I'm going to try this one because I think, having looked at what it looked like when I took the stencil off on the good areas where the Dixie Mud hadn't obviously gone a bit weird, which was completely user error, I think that the pattern scale might be too large for this little door. So with hindsight, I'm glad it happened because I think it would have just looked too big and out of proportion for this little tiny cabinet. So I'm going to use a pattern that's a bit more kind of delicate and smaller. This is the Morocco stencil from Dixie Belle. Also, this is just going to continue to fight me. I've decided I can't take the glass out. It's not glass. I can't take the perspex out of the door because of how the door is made. So I'm going to chop my stencil down. I know that I'm very fortunate in that I can chop my stencil down, because once you chop a stencil down, it's final. You can't put that bad boy back together. So I am very fortunate that I'm able to do this. There are a couple of other solutions that you could try. Like I say, the glue usually does work, but I think the problem is because of the size of this tiny little piece. I mean, it's only this big, so I am fighting with it. A sort of kind of A4 size stencil might kind of work better. So I'm going to snip it down, and I'm going to see if that's going to help us get the stencil flat to this surface. Once I'd cut the stencil down, I did put some of the spray mount on the back of the stencil, again, just to keep it in place and hold it as flat as I could to the panel. Okay, take 2 on the Dixie Mud. Exactly the same process as before, just apply a super thin layer over the top. Try and get it as even as possible because there's that less sanding to do later on. I just like to put a super thin layer over the top because even the smallest amount of product will show up as a raised stencil. You don't need to apply this really thickly for it to show up. And then what I like to do is to get a nice soft brush before the Dixie Mud has had a chance to dry, lightly spritz it with water, and then just really lightly run that brush over the surface. This is going to get rid of any ridges that have been made with your spatula and just makes it really nice and smooth. Now for the moment of truth. Usually when you lift in a stencil off, when you've done a raised stencil, you want to hold it at either side and lift it straight up in the air, which is going to reduce the risk of smudging the wet Dixie Mud. However, I snipped my stencil down and I couldn't really do that, so I had to lift it from one side and peel it off, which isn't ideal, but it did work in this instance. I think that went okay. There's a couple of areas here and here, basically the areas where there was a tiny gap where the stencil was being forced up in the air away from the surface of the door, but that can be sorted. They're not too bad. I'm also going to fade this design out around the edges so I can sort that out. I'll show you how we do it. The most important thing to do now is leave it to dry completely. Don't try and mess with it. Let it dry. Let it dry completely before you start tinkering with any issues like I've got here. Okay, so this has been dried overnight. As you can see, it's gone a lot paler. You can tell when it's dry with the brown and the black because they do go paler. Obviously the white stays white, but I would always advise to leave it overnight because then you know for sure it's completely dry. As you can see, there are some slight imperfections around the edge that are not perfect, and that's where the stencil had slightly lifted around the edges and I couldn't quite get it to lie flat. It's not a problem. It sands really easily. Dixie Mud sands super easy. So I've got an old sanding sheet from my electric sander. This is a 120 grit, but it's been well used, so it's very worn down. Don't sand it with anything too harsh because it will just sand down really easily. The other thing I've got is a Dixie Belle sanding sponge, which is equivalent to a 220 grit. These are really nice for just kind of taking any rough corners off and making it nice and smooth. So I'm going to start with this and I'm just going to take off the kind of areas that I'm not too happy with. So that's got the kind of imperfections and I've just knocked those down so the design kind of fades out to the exterior bit of the frame. And then for the kind of pattern in the middle, it's all turned out pretty much okay. If you do have any areas where you've kind of smudged it or anything, you can fold up a piece of sandpaper like this and you can kind of correct it with sandpaper. Like I say, it sands down really easily. But what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to take this sanding sponge and I'm just going to really lightly sand over the entire piece. That's going to get rid of any kind of harsh edges or anything where I've left a little bit of texture in the Dixie Mud, and that will just give me a nice smooth finish. And then there is an extra step that I like to do, but you don't have to do. You can literally go ahead and paint straight over the top of this. But I like to just seal everything with a clear coat. I'm using Dixie Belle Satin just because it's nice and easy to use. And you can absolutely paint over the top of this clear coat with any of the Dixie Belle paint ranges, so that's not going to cause any problems. But what it does is, because the Dixie Mud is a different surface to the surface underneath this, it's a different material. Sometimes, not always, sometimes when you paint over the top of it, that is apparent because it absorbs the paint differently to what's underneath does. So it sometimes can look a little bit uneven, not always. I haven't always done this. This is just an extra step I'm doing for this project. And all you need to do is just a real thin coat of clear coat over the top. And like I say, that's just gonna lock it in, and then it's not gonna cause any unevenness when you do add paint. All that's left to do now is remove the tape, which is always a risky business when there's a camera involved because it never goes to plan. It doesn't for me anyway. Remove the tape, and once that clear coat has completely dried, you're ready to paint in whatever finish you want. Well, the tape pull went to plan, so that's always a bonus. And that's it. That's all I'm going to do for this video, because I just wanted to just give you a demonstration on that particular. If you can hear any background noise, by the way, that's my dog snoring in the next room. She's really loud. So that was just a real short video on how to do a raised stencil. Like I say, you can apply this technique to any surface you want. You can do it on home decor items. You can do it on the front of drawer fronts. You can do it on the entire piece of furniture. You can just do it on a really small area like this one. But that is going to obviously stay on my YouTube channel. So now from any point forwards, if I do a raised stencil, I've got a more in-depth video of how to do it and how not to do it as well. So hopefully that was useful. Let me know in the comments if you do prefer these bite-sized videos, or whether you just prefer a longer version of a start to finish makeover. As always, thank you for watching, and I will catch you next time. Bye.